In this sublesson, we're going to focus on twisted pair cables that have the name Category X. And most of the time, you're going to see Category 5, Category 5E, and Category 6. As of the recording of this video, Category 6 is the most common, and that's what we'll focus on. And usually I'll refer to it as Cat 6. So let's get started with that now. Twisted pair cable is the most common type of cable used in today's networks. It's referred to as twisted pair because the copper wires inside of the cable are twisted together into pairs of wires throughout the entire length of the cable. And twisted pair cable has 8 wires in total, so 4 pairs, and they're all color coded. Let's show an example of that now. Okay, so here's a twisted pair cable, and this is known as Category 5E. You can see it says right on the cable, Category 5E, and UTP, which is unshielded twisted pair. That's your standard type of cable. It's a 24 gauge cable and has 4 pairs of wires. Here's the connector. That's an RJ45 connector, and this has the 8 wires that we're talking about that are color coded. And if we look at the plug a little bit more carefully here, you'll see that it's a modular plug and it has a tab, and that tab presses in and it allows you to lock the cable into place. And you can see the colored wires here. And these wires, you want them to be within these copper connectors. They need to be underneath those copper connectors in order to get good data connectivity. And you can see these wires go all the way to the edge here. If you look real carefully, you can see they go right to the edge of that RJ45 connector. Now let's take a look at a cable that I've opened. And here are the wires. These are the individual colors and pairs. And you have the orange pair, and it starts with the white-orange wire and then the solid orange wire. Then you have the green pair, the blue pair, and the brown pair. And if you want to ever do a punch down or create your own patch cable, you untwist these and you set them up in order. For example, the 568B order, which is white, orange, orange, white, green, blue, white, blue, green, and white, brown, brown. I strongly recommend that you memorize the 568B and 568A standards. Those color sequences, white, orange, orange, white, green, blue, green, white, brown, brown, that's the 568B. You should know these color sequences for when you're working with network cabling. So these are the twisted wires, and they're twisted all along the length of the cable. The twists help with continuity, and they help to reduce things like crosstalk and interference. So once again, if you ever are wondering about a cable, the good cables are labeled. And an example of that is this patch cable here. Once again, you can see this is a Cat 5E UTP, unshielded twisted pair. And so let's talk about the difference between UTP and STP now. Okay, so UTP versus STP. The cable we just showed, the 2 cables, are both unshielded twisted pair. That's the most common. It's 8 wires surrounded by a plastic jacket, a PVC jacket. But STP is shielded twisted pair. And you use this in case you're worried about electromagnetic interference or radio frequency interference, EMI or RFI. The shielded twisted pair adds an aluminum shield around all the wires inside the plastic jacket, which protects it from that interference. So if you have electrical appliances, HVAC equipment, different cables running or electrical devices, you want to run STP. And sometimes your municipality will require that you run STP if you're doing it in ceilings or in ductwork or what have you. So know the difference between those. And so here's a list of the various categories that you might see. The first one is Category 3, 10 megabits per second max. It's a 10 megahertz cable that is old school, isn't really fast enough for anything we need to do today on a LAN. So if you do see it, it's probably on the way out. So that's an outdated standard. It's still on the objectives, but you should just know the speed of that 10 megabits per second. It should be upgraded to something faster. Category 5 is the next step, and that can handle 100 and 1000 megabit per second networks. It's a 100 megahertz cable. Generally, though, with Category 5, you're going to be limited to around 100 megabits per second, and that's because most LAN technologies only do 1 bit per cycle. So if you have 100 million cycles or 100 million hertz as your operating frequency, then you're going to be able to send 100 million bits or 100 megabits per second. Now, Category 5E goes beyond this. It has better transmission rates for two reasons. One, it's designed better. There's more twists per foot and better quality copper and things like that. But the main thing is the frequency. You can get 100 megahertz Category 5E, but you'll also find a lot of 350 megahertz Category 5E. So it's qualified for 100 and 1000 megabit per second networks as well, but it'll perform much better than Category 5 because you can actually get a better data throughput, upwards of 200, 300, 350 megabits per second. And that's one of the more common ones you'll see, and that's the one we showed, that patch cable. In addition, Category 6 is common. You'll see that is a lot as well. This is good for 1 gigabit and 10 gigabit per second networks. And at this point, as you get into more categories of UTP, you can send more bits per cycle as well, depending on the technology. This cable is rated at either 250 or 500 megahertz if you're using Category 6A. And one of the newer types of cables is Category 7. As of the recording of this video, there isn't that much of that out there, but you'll see this for high-speed connections. It does 1 and 10 gigabit per second networks, and that's rated at 600 and 1000 megahertz, depending on the type. There's even Category 8, which is in the works as well. So know these categories and basically what they're rated for. You know, if you need to run 5 server connections to a master switch in a data center, then you're probably going to want to have 10 gigabit per second connections. And if you can't do fiber optic, you'll probably want to go with Category 6 and get that 10 gigabit connection. Make sure you have 10 gigabit network cards in the servers and make sure you're uplinking to 10 gigabit ports on the switch. Otherwise, if you're connecting computers on the network, you know, Category 5E is actually still okay for that. But in a lot of cases, I'll just go with Category 6 nowadays for all the connections. If I have a high-speed connection to make, I'll consider Category 7. I'll also consider Category 6A, but I'll highly consider fiber optic multi-mode connections. So those are categories of UTP. Typically, the cable twisted pair can go 328 feet before the signal degrades to the point where it can't be read by another device. That's 100 meters. It's about a football field. So it's not really that far, and you have to watch out for that. It's known as attenuation. The signal will degrade over distance and time. So 100-meter max runs you want to do, unless you use a repeater. Next is PVC versus plenum-rated cable. PVC is the standard type cable. It has a plastic jacket, and it's toxic if it burns. So a lot of municipalities will require that you install plenum-rated cable, especially if you're going to do it over the ceiling or in the walls, or in any areas that are not accessible by a sprinkler. So you got to watch for where you're installing and what the rules are in your particular municipality. You got to check that very carefully because any cable runs that you do usually get inspected by an electrical inspector. So what is the plenum rated cable? This uses one of two types of sheaths. It's either going to be a Teflon coated sheath, which doesn't really burn. It takes extremely high temperatures, or it's going to be a low smoke sheath, which burns slowly. And so both of those will be plenum rated. It all depends on what your city requires, but the plenum rated cable will burn more slowly, giving more time for people to get out of the area without breathing in noxious fumes. PVC can turn into hydrochloric acid in a person's lungs, so it could be deadly. So you want to make sure that you install plenum rated cable anywhere that a sprinkler system can't get to. And in some cases, it's got to be used everywhere. And honestly, I use low smoke cable for all the runs that I do. So, or at least low smoke cable. And it doesn't matter where the run's going to go. If it's inside a room or over the ceiling or whatever, I'll always use the low smoke stuff. And generally, that'll be category 6. So know the difference between your standard PVC and your plenum rated cable. You know, if you have patch cables and you're connecting the patch cable from the RJ45 jack to the computer or from the patch panel to a switch, those will just usually be regular PVC. You buy them in bulk, or you can build them yourself if you really want to. But you buy them in bulk and they're just regular PVC. But the longer distance runs, the permanent physical plant runs, should be plenum rated and at least low smoke rated. You may ask, what is a plenum? A plenum is actually an airway, and that is, say, above your drop ceiling is an airway, or within ductwork is an airway. But really, the term is kind of a misnomer, because you really want to have this type of cable, this plenum rated cable, or this low smoke cable, or Teflon coated cable, anywhere that a sprinkler can't get to. That could be inside the wall, or anywhere else that there is no sprinkler access or any other fire suppression access. And lastly, here we have splitters and repeaters. You can split the signal for twisted pair. It generally isn't recommended. If you try to split it, you're going to also split the attenuation rate, the maximum distance, down to 164 feet or 50 meters. If you do that, you might want to add a repeater. A repeater can then extend the signal another 100 meters, another 328 feet, if it is an active repeater. And that means it has to be plugged in. And sometimes to do this, you'll use power over Ethernet. So there's an option for you. So splitters and repeaters. But know that twisted pair cable has 8 wires. Understand the difference between UTP and STP. Know the different categories of UTP, and be especially familiar with category 5E and category 6, because those are the most common you'll see as of the recording of this video, and probably for several years to come. Know that it can be run 328 feet or 100 meters, and understand what plenum rated and low smoke cable is, and know about splitters and repeaters. So that's what you need to know for the A+ objectives. You can get really in depth with this, but that's the basics for twisted pair cable. So that's the end of this sub lesson.